entrare le mani.
All right, let's get started, everybody. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yes, okay. My name is David Nidell. I work for World Agroforestry, ECRAF, but I serve as the Global Strategy Advisor for Yale School of Environment's Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative. It's great to see everybody here, and it's great to have everybody online. First of all, I would like to thank ELTI, the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture, and Yale Forest Forum for co-hosting this event. I am being helped in the moderation of this event by my colleague here, Leili Puspita-Sari, who is the ELTI Indonesia coordinator.
Hello, everyone.
For those of you who might be new to this topic, and I'm thinking particularly those who are online, the term blue carbon refers to carbon that is sequestered by and stored in plants and sediments in mangroves, seagrass beds, and tidal marshes. Conserving and restoring these blue carbon ecosystems have emerged as an important focus of international climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Though much smaller in extent than terrestrial forests, these ecosystems sequester carbon at a faster rate and can bury large quantities of carbon for up to thousands of years. Moreover, they provide a wide variety of other ecosystem services, including controlling coastal erosion, mitigating or buffering tidal surges, serving as nurseries for fisheries, providing an array of non-timber forest products, and helping to clear water from pollution. These blue carbon ecosystems, however, are heavily threatened due to conversion to shrimp and fish ponds, conversion for coastal development, and other causes. So efforts are currently underway to conserve and restore these ecosystems with financing through carbon credits. So that's the basic kind of topic that we're addressing. So the overall goal for today's panel discussion is to look at recent developments or advances in the science, policy, and management of blue carbon ecosystems, as well as to understand what still needs to be done to bring this nature-based solution to fruition. So we are lucky to have 5 experts here, plus, one who will be joining us virtually to talk about these issues. And so I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and then each of them will have 10 minutes to give a short presentation introducing the work that they do on blue carbon, and then we'll open up the floor for questions, some of which we have and some of which will be provided by the audience. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dan Fries, who holds the Cochrane Family Professorship in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Tulane University. His research concerns the quantification of blue carbon stocks and fluxes, how blue carbon changes with deforestation and sea level rise, and the use of blue carbon to incentivize habitat restoration and the establishment of blue carbon credit projects. Much of Dan's research has been conducted on mangroves and seagrasses in Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Pacific. Dan is a member of the Blue Carbon Initiative and the IUCN Mangrove Specialist Group. Welcome, Dan. So next, we have Stephanie Simpson, who will be joining us virtually. Hello, Stephanie. I hope you're there. Stephanie is Senior Blue Carbon Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Global Strategies. She supports TNC's state and country programs to develop market mechanisms that support coastal wetland restoration and conservation. Her focus is on developing a pipeline of blue carbon offset projects and exploring other innovative financing mechanisms, such as resilience credits. She has managed the development of coastal wetland carbon methodologies approved under VERA's Verified Carbon Standard and advises on blue carbon market project development with field teams on an international scale. Once again, welcome, Stephanie. Next panelist is Jacob Bukowski, who is an assistant professor and the director of the Forest and Climate Change Graduate Certificate at Oregon State University's Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society. His research focuses on conservation management and restoration of forests, including mangroves globally. Prior to joining OSU, he was a postdoctoral associate at Conservation International's Moore Center for Science. In addition to his position at OSU, Jacob is also a science advisor at Carbon Direct. Welcome, Jacob. All right, next we have Hasna Nikma. Hello, Hasna. Hasna is a natural resource management specialist at the World Bank in Indonesia, where she focuses on enhancing sustainable financing for landscape management and strengthening the operationalization of Indonesia's Environment Fund. Since 2021, Hasna has been a key team member of the largest mangrove restoration project globally, where she has spearheaded the development of sustainable mangrove management strategies in Indonesia and initiatives on blue carbon financing. Previously, Hasna had a pivotal role in advising the government of Indonesia's peatland restoration agency on achieving the world's largest peatland restoration target. Welcome, Hasna. And last but not least, Benjamin Brown. Ben, hi, good to see you. So Ben is a postdoctoral fellow at Charles Darwin University in the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, where he is investigating the feasibility of blue carbon finance in an Indigenous community in the Northern Territory of Australia. Prior to moving to Australia, Ben lived and worked in Indonesia for 20 years, where he founded a small grassroots nonprofit called Blue Forest, which has restored over 2,400 hectares of mangroves and run 220 coastal field school programs for rural livelihoods. Ben remains actively involved with Blue Forest, which is currently engaged with integrated mangrove management projects in Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Papua. Ben also currently consults for the World Bank, assisting the government of Indonesia in delivering the mangroves for its coastal resilience project. Welcome, Ben. Great. Well, so these are our 5 panelists, and now we are going to, oh, I'm sorry. Geez. Okay, so we're going to now move over to the presentations, starting with Dan, and you can use that clicker. Thank you. You want to hold it for you? Sure.
Okay, thanks. Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm only gonna give a short presentation. It's really, I'm just showing some nice photos of mangroves around the world to make you feel jealous. But you know, they are such a beautiful ecosystem. Any opportunity I have to show them off, I will take. And also I like this photo because it's not just mangroves, but it's also seagrass. So we're getting multiple blue carbon ecosystems and really how we understand the seascape and not just individual ecosystems, I think is going to become increasingly important, particularly in blue carbon science, but we're also starting to see this connectivity and seascape approach in management more broadly. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to the sort of stuff I do, but I want to do it in a way of telling a story of how science has been obviously integral to the foundation of this blue carbon field, and that the blue carbon management really is based on a lot of really good science, but how that has evolved and how a lot of science is now translational, which hopefully makes links with some of the later presentations. So yeah, this is my natural habitat. And you can't tell it there, but I'm taking samples. And so often we'll do a lot of work on blue carbon quantification, so measuring stocks and fluxes and things like that in these kind of environments. Very difficult to take a soil core there though. And understand kind of, you know, how much blue carbon is actually in these systems and what does it amount to and what is usable for management. So certainly there's a lot of basic science on the different components of the carbon cycle that we really need to understand. And particularly the pools and processes in the carbon cycle that are relevant for quantifying carbon credits or national accounting. So I'm very interested in measuring those components. So we don't have to measure everything in a mangrove, but there are many aspects which are relevant then for management later on. But then what do we do with that information afterwards? Well, we want to understand how it's transformed, because you know, you can only really generate Blue carbon is not really a science concept. It's a policy concept. It's a tool that is about managing ecosystems for a net climate benefit. And there's a need to do that because this is a common site. This is a aquaculture pond being developed in Indonesia, and this is common in many parts of the world. I said I was going to show you really nice, beautiful photos, but unfortunately, this one is not it. This is probably the most heartbreaking thing I've ever seen in a mangrove of clear cutting after harvesting for community use in southwest Madagascar. So this is why blue carbon exists as a concept, because we want to minimize these two examples and the other examples that we have around the world as heavily threatened ecosystems, but also provides us with this additionality of which we can, if we can reverse these or restore them, that gives us our blue carbon benefit. So I have a lot of interest in understanding what the consequences of these kind of land use changes are for carbon, and what it means for management. Of course, these are very kind of direct human drivers of loss, and there are more kind of indirect drivers of loss and stress on the system as well, like sea level rise. And so we're very interested in those kind of questions, which are much longer term, much more invisible, but have a real impact on the permanence of blue carbon. Because again, it's not really going to make much difference to climate change if we just save some carbon for 5 years. That's not going to have an impact. It's not a time scale of relevance to climate change. So understanding long-term permanence under sea level rise and other climate stresses is really important. And then we hope that all of that information is useful then to figure out where and when and how conservation and restoration can happen. And this is maybe where our work is maybe more translational to people that are able to implement blue carbon strategies on the ground. And I think I got interested in that kind of conversion of like pure science to more applied science, being where I did most of my career in Singapore. Singapore is not famous for its blue carbon ecosystems, though it does have some, but it is famous as being a global financial hub and having a lot of stakeholders who are interested in climate change mitigation. A lot of companies based there that have net zero commitments and have heard of this thing called blue carbon, right? And it was, one day somebody turned on a tap of interest in blue carbon, and it's never been the same since. And so we're very happy to help different stakeholders beyond academia to understand what blue carbon means, how they can contribute, and also, I don't know, if they come across opportunities but they're not so comfortable with it because it is an emerging field. Does this smell right? Does it look right? And kind of the first pass at feasibility of potential projects. And it's been really encouraging to see that a lot of these different stakeholders have been drawn to blue carbon because it's evidence-based and because they want to do a job with high integrity and high quality. And so we found that the science input and the evidence base in that has been attractive to a lot of different stakeholders. And the blue carbon at the end of the day has just been a nice language that is more accessible to all these other stakeholders beyond academia. And we are seeing this happening, and even in my own research, I'll give you just a few examples. This is an aquaculture pond at high tide. It used to be mangroves, and I will show you a photo of that same site in a year's time, and there will be mangroves on it now. But there is, again, supported by a corporate partner, there is a restoration project happening in urban Singapore now, based on a framework that you're going to hear later, because it was our colleagues at Blue Forests that really helped us conceptualize how to do this restoration project. And having this great opportunity to work with other collaborators. This is our collaborators in Baja California Sur in Mexico, Costa Salvaje, who are also interested in community-based restoration. But blue carbon has been a driver of many of their stakeholders to do this restoration. So yeah, it's just fun to go beyond academia and work with these different groups. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any questions here for Dan? And then Will, is there any way to see if there are ones on Zoom? No? No questions? Anybody? Okay, if not, we'll move on to Jacob. Thank you, Dan.
Great, thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So I took the intro slides in a slightly different fashion, but just giving you a little bit of a perspective in terms of my own work in mangrove ecosystems, and some of the various hats that I've worn as I've worked in this space. So it's funny, the last time that I actually was on this stage, I was also talking about mangroves. This was 8 years ago, and I was presenting my master's thesis work as a graduate of this program. So it's kind of nice to be full circle and back on this stage talking about mangroves again. But in any case, I'm an assistant professor at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. And I work across a variety of ecosystems, but have been working in mangroves since around 2012. I first moved out to Thailand as part of a study abroad program, spent about 3 years there, worked in a variety of projects, including radio tracking king cobras, which was a bit of a wild thing at the time. I realized I wanted to work with things that were not venomous and didn't bite, and mangrove seemed like an exciting and very cool opportunity. Blue carbon was really taking off at this time, and I connected with a United States Agency for International Development program called Lowering Emissions in Asia's Forests. And they were really interested in developing the science and modeling for how we quantify carbon stocks in mangrove forests. And so I got plugged in with this program, moved down to a mangrove forest at a biosphere reserve in southern Thailand, and have continued to work in these fascinating and wonderful ecosystems for the last decade. Because once you start working in them, you begin to develop, you become a part of a community. There's really fantastic people that are working in the space. They're fascinating organisms. They're super special, and really a poster child for thinking about not only climate change mitigation, but also the resilience and socioeconomic benefits for coastal communities across the globe. So yeah, so I've worked in Southeast Asia for many years. I lived in Thailand for 3 years, as I mentioned. I've sampled, done field work in 3 or 4 different forests across Thailand, I think 5 or 6 across Vietnam. I've also become engaged in teaching and capacity building and working with governments across the globe for thinking about how they actually quantify carbon stocks in mangroves, blue carbon, and how they report all this information to international agreements, whether that be part of their nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement or thinking about entering the voluntary carbon market. So really trying to think about this from an applied aspect and envisioning how the science of carbon quantification, carbon cycling, how all this plugs into policy to support the conservation, management, and restoration of these forests. So again, really wonderful people that work in this space, and you'll meet these people all over the globe. My research group at Oregon State University uses a variety of tools to do this. So we certainly have a lot of quantitative methodologies that we're employing. We use statistical modeling, so using field data to parameterize models and fill data gaps. We also do a lot of spatial analyses to try to map blue carbon across the globe. Interestingly enough, mangroves, I would argue, are some of the best mapped ecosystems on the planet. There are incredible people that are doing a lot of spatial analyses of these complex coastal landscapes and at very, very high spatial resolution. So somebody who has affinity and a love for spatial sciences, it's a really wonderful place to be able to work. So that's just one cool angle of blue carbon and mangrove work more generally. And then, I also try to bring an interdisciplinary standpoint to my work. And so certainly talking to coastal communities, thinking about policy implications, thinking about the communities who exist in these forests and the impacts of these projects and policies and programs and what it might mean for their own livelihoods is really fundamental and core to this idea of blue carbon and what it can do for mangrove conservation and restoration. And then two other hats that I wear. There's a program called Silva Carbon, which is in between a lot of federal agencies here in the United States. It's funded by the US Department of State and the US Agency for International Development, and implemented by the Forest Service and the US Geological Survey. But there are also folks such as NASA, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, a whole host of these large bodies that work to try to help countries improve their reporting, the monitoring and reporting of carbon emissions from land use and land cover change. And so I recently got plugged in with this group a couple of years ago, and through that have been able to work with really incredible individuals across the globe in Thailand, Gabon, Guatemala, Cambodia, Peru, and then others have gone to other countries as well. But we work with governments to try to understand, how are they including mangroves in their national forest inventories, their monitoring, their reporting under international agreements, and try to, in a very tailored approach, think through how we can support them to improve their data and better integrate it into policy. So that's a really wonderful group and a cool program to be part of. And then lastly, I'm also a science advisor at Carbon Direct, which is in the for-profit space. It's a startup that thinks about carbon dioxide removal more generally. And through this position, I get to review a lot of different carbon dioxide removal projects and programs on the voluntary carbon market, as well as some other markets as well. And so I have had the chance to actually review a lot of, well, not a lot, because there's not so many that are out there, but a handful of blue carbon projects that are trying to bring carbon credits onto the market and access the voluntary carbon market. So it's very cool to see these projects and how they're developing over time, and thinking about the protocols and the science and how we can actually use the idea of blue carbon to support mangrove stewardship more broadly. So that's all I had, but yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Do you have any questions either in the audience or on Zoom? Oh, sorry. Prominent aquanaut Fabian Costa recently urged caution in putting a price on marine ecosystems, arguing that too many actors in the blue carbon economy are focused on short-term gain, are out of sync with the way nature works. What do the speakers think about this? This is kind of a broader question. I don't. That's
a big one.
We might want to save that to a later time for the whole panel.
I don't know if my intro spiked that or what.
How about if we come back to that one? It seems like an excellent question, but okay, moving on to our next introductory presentation would be Stephanie, who is online. Sorry, can you advance?
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great. Am I sharing my slides or you have a copy?
We have them here.
Okay.
So we're on the introductory slide, exploring blue carbon market opportunities.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me, and sorry I cannot be there in person. Just the travel schedules did not allow that this week. But I'm Steph Simpson. I'm the Senior Blue Carbon Manager at the Nature Conservancy, where I sit on our global team specifically to tackle climate change. And on this team, my role is to support our country and state programs to explore blue carbon market opportunities, and that's what I'll talk to you a little bit more about today. So next slide. So
Okay.
there's a lot of reasons to invest in blue carbon. Carbon markets is just one, but we do see that the interest in markets is actually what drives a lot of investment in building up blue carbon science. And when we have blue carbon science, there's a lot of different ways that then we can then use that. One is to just have a better understanding of the climate mitigation role and how that varies across ecosystems and habitats across the world. But also it can support the inclusion of blue carbon habitats into policy mechanisms, particularly into national inventories and nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And this is really important because if these ecosystems aren't being included into policy mechanisms, then they're not going to be prioritized. So that's an important avenue when we can build up blue carbon science, even if it's in the interest of markets that we're contributing to their adoption into policies as well. Of course, it brings new partners and funders to the table who can help support this work, which is massively underfunded to restore and protect these systems. And when we're restoring and protecting blue carbon ecosystems for the climate mitigation benefit, we're also supporting all the other ecosystem services that these habitats provide. So fisheries, biodiversity, connection to livelihoods, coastal resilience, all of that gets supported when we support climate mitigation benefits. So a lot of reasons why we're really interested in blue carbon markets is to also help drive some of these other approaches to using the science. Next.
Yep.
So we at TNC we're really focused on building the enabling conditions for market projects. Blue carbon is still really new and novel, and so there's a lot that we have to really build from the ground up to provide access to carbon finance. So this is kind of a list of some of those things that these are very complex projects, so it's really pulling together a lot of the right parties, stakeholders, data, information, and building that capacity in country. For example, we need to understand what are the different methodologies that are approved, what are the better methodologies to be applied in a given location. You need to, of course, have kind of project site identified. That sounds kind of obvious, but it's not always obvious when there's an interest in kind of market finance. Needing to understand and having the right data. And data, it's not just the blue carbon, greenhouse gas flux data, but also the habitat mapping data. Some of this has been mentioned by my colleagues. Understanding the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, increasing storms, those kind of impacts that are also going to impact the longevity of these systems. And then when it comes to markets in particular, understanding who owns the land, who would own the carbon rights. This can be really complex in coastal landscapes where you might have government owning some of the resources like mangroves, but communities living near them, even accessing or using those resources. So really important also to have community engagement from the start, understanding all the different stakeholders who may be impacted by a restoration or conservation project. And then engaging with the government at all levels across the board as well. Next. Okay. So these are kind of I would say the kind of challenges that we face along the way, but also the opportunities. What for me keeps blue carbon really challenging, but it's an exciting field to be working in. I mentioned, trying to identify projects. We really need to identify projects at scale, and this can be really hard across the coastal landscape, but it's also an opportunity to really forge together and bring partnerships across different actors and entities that are working within the coastal landscape. And then when it comes to understanding the legal or social implications of a market project and building that data, this is again another great opportunity to build local capacity. Sorry, there's a little bit of an echo I'm getting. All right, sorry. So as we work to build local capacity at the government level, but also in building up the blue carbon science in country, we really try to focus on building that capacity up in countries so that countries are less and less reliant on outside or overseas contractors and technical expertise. And then costs. These projects are costly in most countries. It's expensive to restore a coastal ecosystem because you are manipulating hydrology or sediment flows, and they're just difficult areas to access a lot of times. So it's really important to understand what is the cost of doing these projects, and what is the potential carbon revenue that would be generated. And that helps to really set expectations as well for countries or project developers and investors at the start to really understand what piece of the overall project cost could be supported by carbon finance, since carbon finance is likely not to cover all of the different cost implications. Next. Oh yeah, I think I was going to mention that we do have a blue carbon cost tool that we're working on at TNC that is going to be launching early next year to help support project developers in understanding the true cost of these projects. Next. So there's two main type of, when I say project interventions or project like restoration and conservation, we think about this in terms of actually avoided loss or removals for carbon projects. So you want to really think about what is the behavior change that we're trying to incentivize with carbon markets, and whether that's identifying an actual a threat to the habitat and how your interventions are going to mitigate that threat, or understanding why there's a need for restoration. What is the underlying cause of degradation in a system, and how are your actions actually going to address that cause so that restoration is successful and can last, is sustainable as well. Next. So this is a map of some of the places that we are currently working with our field teams and other partners on the ground to scope out and develop blue carbon projects. And I'll take the remainder a couple of minutes to go into detail of I think about 3 different case studies I was able to include. Next. Yeah, you can go to the next slide for I think Virginia case study.
Okay.
Yep. So Virginia case study, this is the one I'm most excited about. I've been part of this project since actually before I was even at TNC. We've been really working to bring this to market to pilot blue carbon credit projects for seagrass. So this project is actually in the final stages of validation and verification with the carbon standard Vera. And once we finally have credits issued, it will be the first seagrass credits globally and the first blue carbon project in the US to get to market. And this really had all the enabling conditions from almost from the start, really, which really, that's why we chose to work in this location to pilot out and demonstrate this as a proof of concept. There was a lot of research ongoing with the University of Virginia around successful restoration methods. There was a lot of data already around the climate mitigation value of seagrass restoration, and a great partnership across agencies and with TNC as well to again, provide all the right enabling conditions to bring this project to market. And this was, there was a wasting disease several decades ago that wiped out eelgrass in the Chesapeake Bay area. And now restoration, the conditions and the water quality are finally at the right point to be able to successfully restore seagrass. So very excited about this project. Next. And then another project that we're excited about is in Australia. I think one of my fellow panelists mentioned Australia already, but our program team, TNC Australia, has been working to also pilot blue carbon under Australia's regulatory carbon credit scheme. These projects are working with small landholders, so it's very complex to kind of pull together a project at scale across these small landowners, but the scaling potential is really immense. This is called the Blue Heart Project. You can see why that's named that in the map here of the project area. But it's restoring agriculture, like low agricultural land to low productive agricultural land back to salt marsh and mangrove habitat. So great scaling potential for this, where carbon finance is playing a real role to incentivize landowners to participate. Next. And then the final kind of case study I was going to mention is more of work that we're doing across a region within the Caribbean. There's a lot of opportunity for mangrove restoration in the Caribbean, specifically for areas that have been impacted by development and agriculture, but also by hurricane impacts. And so we're really working to build a lot of those enabling conditions from the ground up. The photos on the screen are from a training that we held, training university and a government agency and nonprofit, local nonprofit individuals in country on how to actually go out and do your field surveys for mangroves. And so we're working to continue to build that capacity in country on the science, on land tenureship, understanding market opportunities, and also to establish larger mangrove restoration coalitions. So I think that's all that I had. I think this is last slide is just my name. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to present, even though remotely, and happy to take questions if there's any.
Great, thank you so much, Stephanie. Any questions, either here or on Zoom? Yes.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Hold on, we need to get a microphone to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm a master's student here, second year of a environmental management program, worked mostly with forest carbon. And I understand that one of the challenges is always to ensure communities are engaged in projects from an early stage. And there is also a lot of expectations management around potential new revenue sources, what type of activities can be implemented once a project has initiated, etc. I'd be curious if you could speak, and maybe this can also be perhaps at the end of the initial presentations, but if you could speak a little bit about the specific tools that you have used in the different initiatives to engage and maintain communities as key owners of these initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I can say, part of our market work, I will say, is kind of building the car as we're driving it. So we're learning and building those tools as we're working with communities and realizing there's a better way to do things and making sure that we're involving communities from the start. That said, we do have tools that we've come up with the last couple of years, including TNC's Human Rights Tool, which is publicly available. You can search for that online, TNC Human Rights Tool. And that helps with a process and templates and everything for our teams to make sure that we're following, FPIC, so free, prior, and informed consent process, identifying the right stakeholders throughout. So it's a very complicated process, more than I would have. That's probably a whole nother presentation and webinar, but it is an integral part of how we work with communities and design projects from the start. So it really starts out with those initial scoping phases when we're scoping out where there's a need for restoration. We're also scoping out, well, who lives and works and interacts in this area, what communities are involved, what agencies, what local, nonprofits or other entities. So it's not just habitat mapping, but it's also stakeholder mapping. And then from there, you would develop your engagement plan and include that as part of the project design process. Hopefully that somewhat starts to answer your question. It's a big question to answer.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And it's a question we can return to with the full panel here. We have people with a lot of experience on this kind of area. So next, let's see. Oops, sorry, there's some extra slides here. Okay, next, Hasna.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah, my name is Hasna. I work for the World Bank office in Jakarta, Indonesia, including the work on project that focus on landscape, including the mangrove ecosystem. The contents of my presentation will be more on the national Indonesia's level, so provide an update of what happened in the management of mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia, more specifically on the policy and governance perspective. So why mangrove Indonesia is important? So Indonesia is the home to the largest mangrove ecosystem in the world, as I believe everyone in this room knows. A quarter of the world's mangrove ecosystem is in Indonesia. The mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia provides key goods and services across sectors that benefit the local communities, the national economy and also the populations of the world. The World Bank did an analysis on the mangrove economic report in Indonesia, which shows that the mangrove ecosystem value yield up to 50,000 US dollar per hectare per year. But of course, it depends on the locations. As mentioned also before by my colleague, mangrove is not just the mangrove itself, but also people that live within the mangrove ecosystems. So in Indonesia, more than 120 million people live within the coastal area of Indonesia, which make the value of mangrove ecosystem is higher. So we did, the World Bank did the report that shows at least there are 5 sectors that has highest contributions of the mangrove ecosystems. First, the mangrove ecosystem provide the highest ecosystem service to protect the coastal for example, flooding, erosions, and then the second place is support on the fisheries, and the third is for the climate regulations. While the mangrove ecosystem provide great benefit for the nations and the global populations, but however, the mangrove degradations will keep continued at least until 2030. The government of Indonesia in its official document mentioned that at least more than 750,000 hectares mangrove will be degraded by 2030. This is due to the conversion of mangrove ecosystem to what they called as the blue economic activities, including fisheries, aquaculture, and ponds. However, the good news is the government of Indonesia since 2020 developed a series of the corrective actions for the management of the environment, including mangrove ecosystem. The government of Indonesia updated its second NDC that includes mangrove. The government of Indonesia also developed the forest and other land use netting strategy. That's basically to make the forest and other land use into a carbon net sink by 2030. That includes mangrove. The government of Indonesia also has the largest, most ambitious mangrove restoration target the whole world to restore 600,000 hectares of mangrove ecosystem within 5 years. And last but not least, this is very much key in terms of how the government can deliver that mandate is they created a special agency that focused on restoring the mangrove ecosystem called the Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency. So why this new institution is important in Indonesia? So one of the key challenges of managing mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia is the mismatch regulation and unclear governance arrangement of the mangrove ecosystem. So the mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia falls under at least 2 regimes. The one that I highlighted is the basic law that then created the mismatch regulations and unclear governance arrangement. So the mangrove divided into 2. First is the mangrove that falls under the forest area. It represents 70% of the mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia. And the mangrove that falls outside forest area, that count 30% of the mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia, which managed by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. So there are 2 central ministries that has its own target, that has its own technical guideline. So the mismatch happen. The different target within the national context happen. And this agency on the mangrove ecosystem then being a laboratory for how the government first setting up a target on how to manage the mangrove ecosystem. Second is to develop a technical implementations for how to manage the mangrove ecosystem. And then third is scaling up to other stakeholders and making it into an overarching strategy. The institution had a lot of series of coordinations, discussion within the nations, but also with development partners. So in the past 4 years, the institutions has been working on integrating the landscape management approach in delivering the mangrove restoration target. One of the project that the BRGM work is with the World Bank under the Mangrove for Coastal Resilience project that aims to restore 75,000 hectares of mangrove and also conserve or sustainably manage more than 400,000 hectares of mangrove ecosystem within 5 years. The approach is balanced investment within the restorations, conservations, but also putting the community at the heart of the implementation, so sustainable livelihood support, and also making sure that there is innovation in terms of blue carbon payment generating from the rehabilitations and also conservation efforts. With the strong political will, with the PRGM, the specific agency, that key role is to restore the mangrove ecosystem, that shows a very good progress. Within 4 years, the government have been able to triple the result of the mangrove restorations compared to the past 10 years before the BRGM existed. The agency also able to move from business as usual, that is only planting, to more than or beyond planting. In the picture, it shows how the community engagement started from the participatory planning. It also shows the picture of how the government is actually provide technical assistance to the local communities, up to how they are implementing the rehabilitation by having a minor hydrological intervention. Pak Ben will be explore more about the technique of restorations, but it just shows how when the government have first the same goals, second institutions, and also third the technical manual and how they do that, good progress is on the way to respond and answer to their target. However, with the great progress, and we believe that Indonesia is in the right track of managing its mangrove ecosystem, there's always a political changes, right? Last Sunday, the government in Indonesia, we have the new president, which we hope that within the new administrations, the mangrove ecosystem will still be prioritized, and the work on restoring and managing the mangrove ecosystem will be continued. So this is the recommendations of how do we making sure that the mangrove ecosystem management will still be continued. It first is to make sure that the agenda is remain important, and that includes in adequate policy, for example, the midterm national strategy, implement or more engagement with the subnational government. Decentralized mangrove management will be key. That will also include engaging with local communities, strengthening the baseline mangrove mapping, MRV, that will be key. For now, the government of Indonesia has been trying to improve the mangrove mapping data, the MRV, to make sure that then if they want to access the financing from the blue carbon, they have all the necessary tools. And last but not least is securing payment for the blue carbon, which this is work on progress. That's it from my side.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you. Any questions for Hasna, either in the audience or from online? Okay. Okay, will there be a recording? Yes, there will be a recording that we can share. What is the role of the international voluntary carbon market in the future of mangrove restoration in Indonesia? Would you like to address that?
Now
Now?
or later?
It-
Okay, yeah. Interesting question and very important. I think this is a burning questions in the past 4 years. So over the past 4 years, I think the government of Indonesia has been focusing on meeting the NDC target. But just last week, we have launched key critical manuals on how to measure the blue carbon project, and also how to measure the blue carbon credits. This is a very good opening windows of the government Indonesia in accessing voluntary carbon markets. And also, this is actually very in line with the spirit of the coming government in terms of accessing more investment, including from the restorations activities. So at least from now on, the voluntary carbon market seems to be one of then the main agenda moving forward.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Last but not least, let's turn to Ben.
Thank you.
Yes.
Test. Everyone can hear? Great. I will begin with an acknowledgement of First Nation communities relevant to this talk and my life. So the Larrakia people, the saltwater people of Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia, where I live and work. Also, I think in the slideshow, I showed people in Ramingining and Arafura Swamp who speak Yolnu. There's different clans and communities. And finally, in Papua, Indonesian Papua, the Mimika, the Komoro and the Mimikawe of Komoro of Mimika region, and the Asmat in Asmat. So I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and their role as great stewards of mangroves in those regions. Oh, there I am. I think I'll start. I'm going to go through kind of fast because I have a lot of slides, as always. This is what I would call a resilient mangrove system. It's in Papua, in that Mimika region. And this area is very natural. Yeah, there's not much disturbance, though there is as well. But in this area, there's shorelines that are eroding and accreting. This is 4 pictures from an erosional shoreline. But the mangroves there are diverse and fill different functional roles. So as there's large-scale erosion at the coast in the Omega area, then the system reorganizes and is colonized by halophytic grass, which then captures mangrove propagules, which then grow and mature. And maybe the whole system slides back a little bit with sea level rise or erosion or things like that. It's a resilient system. And I just thought I'd show a picture of a resilient mangrove system before. One of these sad pictures like Dan showed of dead mangroves in an aquaculture landscape where they create dike walls to enclose the mangroves, which drowns them. And then they raise fish or shrimp in this ring ditch around near the dike wall, and in the central plateau, nothing much happens in shallow water where sometimes mangroves can grow, but they don't grow very well. Past failures around mangrove restoration, I like to talk about a little bit. Just this is very classic picture of a good intention, but poor execution, where they planted mangroves in front of a very healthy mangrove forest out to sea. And you can see the healthy mangroves behind that, but mangroves don't naturally grow there. Otherwise they would be growing there because there's mother trees nearby. And so they've just planted lots of mangroves to die here, and they died within a few months. And this area has been planted 9 times in 12 years since I've been looking at it. And what remains are these bamboo sticks that indicate where they planted mangroves. That's a practice we want to move off of. Here's some photos of best practice. This is in South Sulawesi, eco-hydrological restoration of shrimp ponds that people were no longer using. engagement with the community to begin the whole process. I liked that question earlier. Community engagement from the onset, right? Do they want to restore areas? What areas are viable for restoration? Free, prior, informed consent. Something else to do economically while we restore mangroves, all that takes place. Here's Dan Fries and his student at the time, Rachel O, taking some great measurements to create a digital elevation map in that landscape. In that landscape, we trialed hand planting and minor repair of hydrology, but also we wanted to learn about using excavators in that system and what that costs and all its effectiveness. And that excavator breached dike walls and leveled out some sediment for us. We also replaced undersized culverts, which were restricting tidal exchange in that area, and built a bridge so the community could still access the area, but no more undersized culverts were inhibiting tidal exchange. And afterwards, here's where the plants come in after you fix the hydrology a little bit. We went around and collected propagules from the system and distributed them naturally on the tides. This is called human-assisted natural regeneration. And I have a lot of time series of this, but this is right after the work took place. And a couple years later, it's growing. I think this was 6 years later. And this is nowadays about 10 years after the initial survey. And the areas that we wanted to restore are growing back really well. And some private sector companies going to come in and manage the remnant ponds in that system in an intensified way, which will be interesting to learn from. As Hasna mentioned, this slide, you're not meant to understand anything on it, except that that is a part of the survey or assessment guidelines now to assess viable restoration sites in Indonesia, integrating biophysical aspects as well as social and economic and governance and policy aspects to understand from a transdisciplinary perspective if the area can be restored or not. And it's like we use like a stoplight system. It's green, let go ahead. It's yellow, we still need to work on things. It's red, maybe no restoration possible right now. And this is another slide that just shows that there's actually cost codes nowadays and regulations in Indonesia allowing for eco and ecological and hydrological restoration. Beforehand, you weren't even allowed to do it with the government. So that's why a lot of planting was taking place as well that wasn't succeeding. And here's using like assessing restoration opportunity in the project. Hasna talked about mangroves for coastal resilience in 4 provinces based on government data, and then we did a rescreening of restoration opportunity, identifying about 96,000 hectares of potential restoration opportunity, of which 75,000 are to be implemented. If it's implemented successfully, these are the calculations of mitigation outcomes from the greenhouse gas emissions reductions from restoration, as well as protection of the 400,000 hectares that Hasna also mentioned. Anyway, the calculations are in there. This was asked earlier, the status of voluntary blue carbon. Hasna already addressed that, but it's happening now in Indonesia, but they gave preference early on to restoration and conservation contributing to their nationally determined contribution NDCs to the Paris Agreement. And I'll close a little by looking at some emergent challenges that we're dealing with while we deliver this stuff at scale. Aquaculture is this big one in the region. The majority of restoration opportunity is in aquaculture areas. And I showed an example above of restoring hydrology in aquaculture areas. We can restore these places quite easily, usually, if people allow us. But there's this compromise developing of planting mangroves in the ponds that are still actively managed as ponds. And of course, people invested a lot in making these ponds legally or illegally, formally or informally, but to get them back for restoration, we're not taking them back forcibly, right? There's clearly a free, prior, informed consent heavy aspect to this work. But the compromise early on that the government in Indonesia is pushing right now, which we still need to address, is planting trees in actively managed aquaculture ponds, which is probably a poor compromise, but we have to get better empirical understanding of that. What we think are the problems are that they are not connected to the the coastal system, riverine systems in general. Their ecosystem service value is low. They're vulnerable to flooding. They don't grow very well. There's lower biodiversity. They might not sequester and store much carbon. Plus, from a social side, governance side, it legitimizes aquaculture in a forest use area by engaging communities a little too simply in trying to restore, to chase these very large targets in a 5-year period, right? So we have some problems to deal with. There are some good examples of silvifisheries, of mangroves and aquaculture in East Kalimantan. This is the Nature Conservancy, or Yekan in Indonesia, working together with my NGO, Blue Forest. They led on this secure program, and we're starting to collaborate. This site in North Sumatra where we work seems to be a good silvifishery site that we can learn from. And they use a different species on the inner platform, Lumnicera racemosa, which is tolerant, less tolerant to salt, to being inundated, but they put mud in the center of their ponds to keep those trees high above the water level. Mahakam Delta is where we work a lot. Half of this landscape, 50,000 hectares, have been converted to aquaculture, and the aquaculture is not productive, but planting trees in the middle of the ponds is probably not a win-win for communities and the ecosystem, but my hypothesis is it's a lose-lose, and we need to investigate that. With colleagues, there's opportunities to research all this. We need help. We are overworked right now under everything else. Here's another land use challenge emerging in Sumatra, Riau. And this landscape is experiencing the combined effects of poor land use over time, over decadal time, and conversion from lowland swamp forest to plantations like rubber and acacia and coconut, in this case, a lot of coconut, and then sea level rise as well in the area. Communities were starting to notice their coconuts weren't very productive, and the land was getting a little salty, so they engaged district government to build a huge dike wall surrounding their coconut plantation to keep the saltwater out. In 2018, there was a 150-meter green belt of mangroves on the outside and some mangroves growing on the inside. We started to see the mangroves on the outside thin, and on the inside, the communities converted the mangroves into rice that year. And 2 years later, the whole place, the dike wall breached, saltwater went inland, and 2,000 hectares to date of coconut plantation has been killed, inundated with saltwater at a great cost, of course, to local community livelihoods and environment. So it's a big problem. This is what it looks like. And before the government goes in and tries to put a hard engineering solution at that breach to try to fix it, which we fear won't work, we want to engage in some hydrodynamic modeling of the system to understand it better and predict what will happen in the future with sea level rise. And here's a picture of what we intend to do, a hydrodynamic model from Australia. And we're going to go up and try to model this place and understand restoration scenarios and what's most likely, and then shop that around with stakeholders to see what they would like to do. For the time being, though, it's like a hard engineering solution and plant mangroves for 1,000 hectares and then somehow save the coconuts in the rest of the system. But that's what people want, and you can't always have what you want. Mick Jagger told us that, I think. Finally, a little bit of my work in Australia. The tidal restoration methodology is up and running and approved. It's our first blue carbon method in Australia that's approved. And Stephanie showed the Blue Heart project, which I just started learning about in Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I was with some Sunshine Coast Council people who are implementing this project directly. And I won't talk about that project. And this is what I'm working on right now, is these water buffalo, which are invasive to Australia, are in abundance in this landscape in the Northern Territory, 16,000 head of water buffalo in a 100,000 hectare landscape. And the community themselves, the Ara Forest Swamp Rangers Aboriginal Corporation, identified controlling buffalo, amongst other things, as a priority in the system, which is a freshwater wetland, which transitions into a salt marsh and mangroves eventually as it goes to the coast. It's a bit confined in the freshwater spot. Here's some elevations I'm just showing and sea level rise predictions, but I just want to show some pictures really of what this all looks like as I close. Here's a vegetation exclusion, a water buffalo exclusion experiment, and vegetation's growing where they can't feed and everything else is devegetated. A devegetated landscape that buffalo move through looks like this, and that creek or river or whatever flowing body that was created by the buffalo because of their movements, they lower of the mud, and water starts draining and flooding through that, including saltwater inland. Here's just buffalo having done some damage, rubbing up against paperbark trees, which are considered a blue carbon system, Melaleuca. Buffalo damage, buffalo damage, buffalo damage. Wallows and compacting this landscape, creating creeks, wallows, etc. I think that's my final slide. It is. And so we, before this might become a methodology in Australia, a blue carbon methodology, there's still some work to do to understand the impact of the buffalo and feral pigs as well on the landscape and quantify it in order to later get baseline done. And this specific system is a little unique to us because it's what we call a blue teal carbon system. It's blue carbon, saltwater, and teal, the fresh water in the back, and there's mixing and dynamics and changing. So we have to understand a lot of factors in the system before we could go ahead, once the methodology is approved, and register this as a blue carbon project. The main activity of which would be shooting to waste, killing water buffalo, invasive water buffalo, which is what the community who owns this land, the traditional owners, want. I will close with that. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. Any questions for Ben, either in the audience or online? Yep.
Hello. Thank you for that presentation. I assume that the water buffaloes and the pigs are not native in Australia.
Yeah.
So my question is, do large animals have a role in like disturbing anoxic like conditions in wetlands that prevent too much methane production? Are they like good in a certain amount, or yeah?
Yeah. Great question. Are you when you start your postdoc out in Australia, we welcome you to investigate this issue. Dan, do you have a response to this from methane? I'll go ahead. Maybe you have a response. I'll stumble through this.
Stumble through it and then I'll stumble after you.
Yeah, I'll just say we don't know exactly what's going on, and people are learning about it in real time. The main things that I'm considering, right, like that we've considered before, is devegetation and lowering of the surface elevation, compaction, and creation of artificial channels, facilitating flooding and drainage in different ways, right? But we don't know the net impact maybe of what all, we feel like there's net emissions, right, taking place. But some of these things may counterbalance each other. And even what we've learned from our past work in restoration, the early years of restoration when things are growing back, and you think, oh, great, everything's getting better and more emissions are being reduced, as we establish vegetative cover, but there's actually more respiration in that system at that early growth time. And so early years of a tidal restoration project may be net emitters still of greenhouse gases before they start storing carbon, significant amounts of carbon, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time. So the specific answer to that is I don't know. And but someone might have a better guess than me on that specific one. No?
I thought that sounded great.
Sounded great? All right. So yeah, more research needed. But I think some people might, Kath Lovelock, Nathan Waltham, Rachel Groom out in Australia, maybe already understand a little bit of that question.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Let's get a microphone first.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is George. I come from the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, where you have a lot of oil spillage and all that. We also have mangroves, mangrove trees, but my question would be, is there any way we can, like through genetic engineering, increase the efficiency or the efficiency of mangroves in helping to clean up some of these clean up spillage, increase the ability to remediate oil spillage? Is it possible by way of genetic engineering?
I think this is probably a question for any of you who want to take a stab at it.
Did Norm look into that out there a little bit?
Yeah, I can. Ben's staring at me, so I'll give it a go.
Pressure's on.
I mean, it's a good question because people ask that question a lot, and people are interested in genetic modification of mangroves for remediation, but also for salinity tolerance and taking those genes to other plants, and also to increase carbon sequestration capacity. There's a whole question on feasibility of that, because those kind of processes are many complexes of genes, right? It's not an easy thing to switch a thing on or off, which is why it's been very difficult to take salinity tolerance from mangroves and apply it to other things. So there's the technical feasibility aspect of it. There's a cost of it. There's the ethics of introducing genetic modified organisms into a very natural environment. And then maybe another ethical issue of, does a technological kind of approach like that distract from the real underlying causes, which is, let's stop the pollution or other ways of remediating pollution. So it's on the list, the suite of options we have, I would say it's probably one of the less feasible ones than some of the other options. Not that even the feasible options are not that feasible, right? Which is why there's a huge issue there in the first place. But yeah, that's just my thought.
Anybody else want to express an opinion on this, or?
I would just urge, if you haven't looked at there's some reports probably, and I'm not sure about papers from Norm Duke, who is an Australian-based mangrove researcher, has done quite a bit of work for Shell and for other groups, non-oil companies in the Niger Delta, right, on mitigating the impacts of oil spills on mangroves, right? So there might be something, and he's a botanist and a genetic, he thinks from the mangroves perspective a lot. It might be interesting, his papers, yeah, Norm Duke.
Great, thank you. So we've already kind of segued into the panel discussion aspect, but we'll start kind of raising some questions. And I would suggest we return to the one that was raised earlier, if that's good for everyone. I'll read it just one more time. Prominent aquanaut Fabian Costa recently urged caution in putting a price on marine ecosystems, arguing that too many actors in the blue carbon economy are focused on short-term gain and are out of sync with the way nature works. What do the speakers think about this? And this is open to anyone who would like to respond. She's smiling, Stephanie.
Sure, I was just kind of formulating thoughts in my head. I guess I would challenge the assumption that the problem is the price and on putting a price on these ecosystems, and rather, how we allow that price, this economy, to impact how we develop projects. Because the purpose of the price is to try to bring some value. We know these it's really hard to assign a monetary value or other value when these ecosystems have, one could argue, just intrinsic value. There's a lot of different ways to value these ecosystems, but how do you connect it to a finance mechanism? That's the real challenge. And then make sure that that finance mechanism is not incentivizing bad actors or projects to be developed in a way that cause more harm than good. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing with markets, is that you have a lot of interest in markets and corporates buying carbon offsets or carbon credits, and that's incentivizing some bad actors to try to do quick projects for monetary gain rather than having the ecological and human impacts that we're.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Jacob?
All right. Yeah, So I was just recently in a NSF workshop on the ethics and social implications of carbon dioxide removal technology. And during that, we talked a lot about carbon tunnel vision in a sense. And I mean, elements of this question do resonate with me. I mean, I think it's an age-old question of, monetary valuation of ecosystems and what they can provide. Because I guess the main critique there is, well, they might not be able to be financially competitive with an alternative land use. So that's a bit of a challenge. But on this idea of carbon tunnel vision, I think carbon is just one aspect of what these ecosystems provide to us. And so I think recognizing the broader value of these ecosystems, whether it be through biodiversity conservation or support of local communities or coastal resilience, the whole suite of things, that's truly extremely important at this point in time. I also think that when we think about market-based mechanisms, particularly the carbon markets, there's a little bit of a preference for removals of carbon dioxide, which tend to be associated with restoration and reforestation type projects, which are fantastic. We need those projects and we need money flowing into those projects. But the benefits of those accrue over a much longer timescale, over many decades, right? Whereas if you think about other projects which are currently not as attractive or desired in these kind of market-based solutions, such as avoided deforestation, there's a bit of a concern around the additionality of these types of programs. It's very clear that avoiding deforestation has massive benefits for the climate and for biodiversity and many of these other things. So thinking about how this financialization of carbon and how that plays out in terms of where funding is directed and which projects are receiving the support and the fickleness of markets is an extremely important question. And maybe I went off on a tangent there, but that's what that question made me think of.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
I have too many responses to that.
So you-
A lot. I don't know how to do it in a balanced way. Throw out some ideas. Or do you want to move on to?
No.
Am I on?
I think you are.
I think it's a great question. And there's ways, you can answer different parts of it in different ways, and just adding some things that maybe from the backside. It's true that unscrupulous actors are now all over the place in the landscapes, carving up spaces to claim for carbon project development. We see it. I was shocked how it's happened in Indonesia. Last time I went to like the Mahakam Delta and found 27 new social forest groups who were comprised of fish farmers. 20, yeah, and they were led by a wealthy individual who got most of the benefit of things, and their workers who were part of the group. Working with a private sector company that I knew was new and I'd never heard of, and two groups out of 27 plus 2 that were working in intact mangrove areas on avoided deforestation, right? And like they'd already been in there and carved up the whole system, and the national, there was all these other projects planned for that area too, but they didn't get there quick enough. So it was like the Wild West, right? Like they're saying, like a gold rush. And then privates, I don't know that was anticipated early on, and how fast private sector can move when something becomes, not even viable, but potential, right? And so I think that it may be a good warning to heed for the future, apart from the other, putting a value on nature and other markets and incentivizing mangrove restoration and protection in other ways, like through natural existing markets and business development that might be sustainable business and things like that. But some of this question shouldn't be discounted, right? And we should be reporting honestly that there is that what's happening, yeah? Because it's exactly happening like this. And anyway, I think as we move on, we have to address these kind of emergent issues, yeah.
Sorry, Leila, would you like to ask the next question?
Sure, yeah. It was a very great opportunity to hear from all the panelists. Like you have a lot of experience all over countries, and I think we have a lot of stakeholders really interested about knowing the status of the methodology of blue carbon crediting. Indonesia, Hasna and Ben, you mentioned that Indonesia has progressing in developing the guideline for blue carbon measurements and also related methodology. But I'm wondering about like generally, like globally, how's the status of the carbon crediting methodologies? And is there any, like advances that already made, and or is there any gaps that we need to address on the carbon crediting methodologies? Stephanie or anyone wants to answer the questions?
Anybody want to take a stab at this?
Stephanie,
Stephanie, are you still there?
I'm back. I seem to have some internet difficulties. I think the status of methodologies is an interesting question because we have a number available, whereas if you asked me a few years ago, I would have been like, that's what we need. We need more methodologies available for blue carbon. And they are becoming more available. There's the Vera methodology. It's going under actually revision right now. There's China program has their own methodology. Australia has one. There's a Plan Vivo one. Gold Standard is creating one. So there are a number of methodologies out there. I think that it'll remain that they'll all continue to need improvements. And it's kind of it's a challenging endeavor to create a methodology that is both accurate and rigorous, but also accessible for developers to actually develop a project, or for communities to develop projects on the ground. And I think we've been more and more leaning towards like increasing that accuracy, increasing that rigor, but sometimes at the expense of accessibility. So that's we'll continue, I think, to see that as methodologies get revised and developed, and we'll see that will continue to have an impact on how feasible it is to get projects off the ground.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Everyone want to add something? Good. Oh,
Okay.
do you have questions or?
All right, I'll move on to the next one. Do we have any more from the audience?
Oh,
sorry.
yeah.
Yep, please.
Maybe building on from that question on methodologies, do you see methodologies like the example you mentioned from China or Australia, that being the advances in terms of having nation states develop their own approaches through local national legislation instead of having international independent bodies having the authority to present a methodology to create estimates for credits? Or is the future looking like a balance between the two? Just curious, because I think in payment for ecosystem services in general, there is a tendency that when national legislation is well designed, within that country, implementation will be better. But of course, countries have different capacities, right, to design these policies.
Questions? Anyone wants to answer that?
Asna, you look tempted.
Yeah, great questions. This is actually has been very hot topics also in Indonesia, because you're describing it very correctly. Like, its country has its own characteristic, right? And it also has its own regulations. But however, if you want to get payment from blue carbon, especially if you want to access the voluntary market, then there's a certain standard that you need to meet, right? For example, the MRV, for example, the benefit sharing plan, for example, the community engagement, safeguard, which all of them really needs to meet with international standard. What happened in Indonesia is that the newly launched regulations is actually combine the national regulation with the international regulation. So they highlight that there is this national regulation, including how to integrate this with the national registry, national registry system, and then how then it can use the internationally acknowledged standard, Vera, Plan Vivo, and the one in Australia. At least those three are mentioned in the document. So yeah, I think combining what the nation have with the internationally acknowledged standard, it's like very important.
And John,
And-
Ben?
No, it was well said, a little. Just like when we were in the rooms, right, where this is being discussed in Indonesia, and it took a while, in 2 years. And they get stuck on some things, right? But then you start to realize things it opens our eyes to why there's bottlenecks. And to me, it was one of the little bottlenecks was like, what technique are we going to use to measure carbon stocks in the landscape? And globally, there's a guidance from Donato and Kaufman and Donato, C4, the C4 methodology, which is pretty standard, and that would suffice the methodologies of Plan Vivo and Vera, for instance. But Indonesia already had, regulations backed by policy with cost codes attached for how you measure carbon and how you measure, for permanent how you measure even the results of restoration, right? Very detailed stuff, and not the greatest. And they get but then it was like, do you want to spend another 6 months or a year or whatever creating, like, using the international methodology, but creating regulations in Indonesia to allow for that measurement to take place by government? Or do you want to just follow the existing regulations and hope those fulfill the requirements of the international methodologies? And it turned out, well, they were just going to make their own methodology. And so, but what I'm saying is there's already these existing regulations and policies and cost codes and things, and you don't want to change too much, right? So you build off what is existing to some extent, and you pick your battles where you have to really make changes. Like, we really wanted to introduce other ways to restore mangroves, so we chose our battle, but then the government responded really quick and made policy to allow us to do what we've been advocating for 20 years, yeah? Ecological restoration. So there were it's like trade-offs, yeah? And you learn about that when you're in the country doing those so like, in other country settings, it might be much easier for them just to adopt an international method.
I don't think it is.
No?
From the other countries that I've worked in, this is a common issue, right?
Oh, yeah.
Thinking about, not only all of these issues, but if a country is responsible for tracking and monitoring emissions from land use and land cover change and reporting it through national official, autonomously generated statistics, they're going to have one data set that they're presenting to the international community.
Yeah.
The idea behind these registrars is that you're trying to align and somewhat coordinate projects that are then going onto private markets, such that they can account for that in their reporting to the international community. Right now, it's very unclear whether those two things can actually ever align, whether that be even over hectares, or if you think about the actual carbon there. So this is a big question,
Yeah.
and a big issue for thinking about, how these two systems mesh and what that means for our tracking of progress to these agreements. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think a lot of countries are grappling with this issue of how do we improve our reporting under international agreements, but also with this voluntary carbon market that is complicating things, for lack of a better word. We need the finance, we need all this, right? We're all working towards the same goal. Both approaches are legitimate in many instances, but there is a friction between these two.
Great response.
Anybody else want? Oh,
We
yeah.
have one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for all your presentations. I feel like I've learned a lot about the broad landscape and also just how varied it is. My question is closely related to the first question on putting a price on these ecosystems, but hopefully a slightly different direction. I really appreciated Stephanie's distinction about the process potentially being the problem more than the idea. And it was also really encouraging to hear throughout the presentations that there are a lot of corporate actors who really want evidence-based solutions. So my question is, what considerations do you have as researchers, but also as practitioners, in framing your research or your work to guard against misrepresentation or greenwashing? And how, like, especially specific steps, and how does this also shape the partnerships you embark on or your collaborators, like green flags, red flags? What does that look like?
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
Expect some great answers.
Dan?
Sure, I can start first. Obviously, whenever we embark on any research project or consultancy or whatever it is, you do your due diligence on that partner, right? I think in some respects, the due diligence is already done for us, because people who are interested in blue carbon is expensive, right? There are cheaper ways of offsetting if you wanted to on the carbon market. You know, you're paying $27 a ton of carbon, where you could be getting it for $7 from a different source, but the same ton of carbon, right? You know, the people that are wanting to get involved in blue carbon are doing it for other reasons beyond purely offsetting, right? Which is why they're willing to pay a premium for this kind of boutique carbon in some respects, right? So that kind of, it's a bit of self-filtering, but then obviously there's due diligence involved in that, and there's plenty of yeah, I guess there's this assumption that academics are desperate for any research funding and will say yes to anything, right? And that's not the case. We're in a good position to say no to opportunities that we don't think align with our own core values, or that we don't think the evidence that we provide would be used in an appropriate way, right? Or that it would be used in a different way from what we intended. Of course, things happen, but you go into that with that intention, right? I think another aspect of this is that the people everyone involved in blue carbon, I think, is very conscious of the issues that have happened in other carbon offsetting approaches. And there's great guidelines now, created not by academics with the input of, but created by other stakeholders involved, where we have principles and guidelines for high quality and high integrity blue carbon. And the number one principle in that is decarbonize first. This is not a replacement for doing other ways of emissions reduction before offsetting. And that is principle number one in those guidelines for a reason. And again, those are guidelines not created by academics, right? They are created by organizations involved in blue carbon, including groups such as the Blue Carbon Buyers Alliance, which is people who want to buy blue carbon and they want to make sure they're buying good ones, right? So they are communicating within themselves. This is not just academics and NGOs telling people what to do, right? This is stakeholders demanding high integrity and high quality carbon. So yeah, learning from previous experiences in some respects, right? So yeah, there you go, just a few thoughts.
Good thing. Fun.
Okay, maybe Stephanie also later, but I have three groups that I will talk about, and I will name one of them but I won't name the other two for reasons that'll be obvious maybe. The first one was a longer time ago, and this is from a practitioner's perspective and engagement in delivering the work. The first one was a big early adopter of blue carbon and interest. And we did some intense assessment together and discussions. And at the end of the day, they wanted too high of a scale. Paying a very low price for a lot of a big area. They wanted 6,000 hectares delivered in 3 years, and we had done 2,000 in 20 years, and we could scale up, but not that quick, and allow these tenurial, the non-biophysical bottlenecks were the problems, tenurial and all that stuff. And so we ended up walking away amicably, I guess, from 8 million euros of investment, right? Which would have been very useful. and like, 16 times of our annual operating budget or something. It was, yeah, well, we had to, because it wasn't gonna, and then the group that worked with them, the project defaulted within a year and a half to really 3. It became evident. It was like, it just didn't deliver. There were some problems and some dishonesty. The second is a positive case. I think 8 years later, I can name them. UBS Bank has gathered together the Climate Collective Initiative, it's called, a bunch of people working on similar issues. And we were upfront with them at the time. Indonesia wasn't ready for voluntary carbon, and it was risky. It would be a reputational risk for us. We didn't want to get hopes up of stakeholders in the landscape. And we said, we'd love to do this work, which we've always done. We don't think carbon finance is assured yet at this point, but we can start the work and see how it goes. And then you'd have first opportunity to, if this could become a voluntary carbon project. And they said, sure. And they decided to fund the first 3 years of work, assessments and community engagement and stuff. And by chance, actually, the methodology is coming to reality now. And we can look about turning that into a carbon project. So that's good news. And the last one was kind of simple, green water, like a mine. I won't say who owns it and operates it and whatever, but wanted a very clear deliverable project, but then their own practices were, when we did our due diligence process, were not good at all. And so we just, we decided no in that case. So but you have to be, it's always a case by case kind of thing. And you have to have a due diligence process, and it works both ways between them and us. But I think in general, there's some good actors coming along, lots of good faith, like with good interest in good intentions, right? Willing to follow processes. All the while, I think someone said carbon cowboy the other day, but I think it's giving cowboys a bad name potentially. Cowboy's an honest living, right?
Yeah.
Cowgirl.
Okay.
Hasna or Stephanie, did you have something you wanted to add?
Just very quickly, build from Dan, and then actually one thing that I think has not been highlighting is actually the carbon credits is not as easy as people has been talking about, right? Especially the timeline that a project will be required. We've been mentioning a lot about the methodology. Actually, in the work that I've been doing, setting out how the nature of the scale of the project, it's so hard, whether you want to go with the project scale, you'll go with the jurisdiction scale. It's also another time that the institution would like to consider adding to the analysis, whether you go with the restorations or conservations, adding to the MRV, the set of data, adding to the institutions, adding to the land tenure issues, safeguard, benefit sharing. So all of this will require time. So while the discussions in terms of the carbon credits is so interesting, we also need to make sure that all of this actually takes time and needs to be very well prepared. One of the projects that we have in Indonesia actually takes more than 10 years to actually implement it, and still ongoing. So I think this is very important for all of us to also have this understanding.
Thank you.
Stephanie, do you want to add something?
Sure, I can just add, I guess kind of briefly that, at TNC as an organization that's invested in, nature and impactful projects and have come under our own criticism in the public for past carbon projects. We do have a process, as you can probably imagine, internally for vetting who we work with, who we sell carbon offsets through to. And we have basically standards that we follow. And I can say, for example, we're not going to be selling carbon offsets to a fossil fuel company. That's just antithetical to the process, right? So yeah, we and also working with partners who are prioritizing, as Dan mentioned, really reducing their overall carbon footprint first, reducing first, and offsets as a supplementary action for, those emissions that cannot be reduced right now, but working towards reducing those in the future.
Great, thank you. Eva, you had a question?
Yes. Thank you all for your amazing presentations and for being here and sharing your work. We're really grateful to have that in our community here, so thank you. I just wanted to loop back to some of the social science and human rights issues. I know you guys have all touched upon them in different ways, and Dan, you ended your presentation earlier today during the biomes talk talking about the complexities on the ground in terms of land tenure and benefit sharing and so forth. And I'm just wondering if you all could talk a little bit about that more in your experiences and how that's being played out in the blue carbon space. I think, who has the rights to buy and sell carbon credits, all these really complicated human issues. And I feel like they're either talked about as an afterthought, but this is very complicated, but I feel like it should be front and center. And there are natural science aspects of carbon and so forth, but there are also really complicated social science aspects as well. And how are you guys encountering this, thinking about it? I know, Stephanie, you mentioned that the Nature Conservancy has a human rights tool, I think. So I hadn't heard about that before. I'm really curious about that. But just in your own work, and I know everyone is in this in different ways, and I know Blue Forest works directly with communities and so forth. So anyway, I would love to just open this up a little bit and hear about your experiences in this regard. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Eva.
Anyone want to begin?
Oh, go Hasna.
You start if you want, or
You start.
I'll go. I gotta organize it a little.
Or maybe Stephanie or anyone?
Structure it. Stephanie's ready.
Stephanie, are you?
Sure, I can try to start us off. I mean, I think it is a very complicated process, and it's going to differ depending on where you're working and who you're working with. I think that's the easiest answer if there is one. We do have this human rights tool that helps provide a process for our teams on the ground, and tools to how to walk them through that process. But in the projects that I've been part of, it really depends on the context. I mean, one of the first things we do also when our teams are on the ground working, habitat mapping, stakeholder mapping, but also understanding legally, do we know who owns the land? Coastal landscapes are really complex. It's not very straightforward in most places. I mean, for example, in India, the government owns mangroves and the carbon underneath them as a natural resource for the country. But you also have a lot of land that has been cleared for agriculture, and then that once it has been cleared for aquaculture, it now belongs to that person who is farming the land. So if you're going to restore it, who owns it? Is it then take that land away from the farmer and give it back to the government? So it's really complex to navigate, because we don't want to do harm with these projects for both people and nature. So I think, I could probably talk all day about the different places where we're working and different processes, but it really is a case by case and working really closely alongside the different government entities and the different communities involved and understanding, how a project is going to impact all these different stakeholders, but also understanding what is the legal landscape in which we're playing. And in a lot of places, it actually comes down to needing to pass new legislation. Actually, for example, in Virginia, the seagrass is owned by the state of Virginia. And that was a little bit more of a straightforward. In the U.S., we're a little bit more straightforward in a lot of places about who owns the land. But we did have to get legislation passed in Virginia that gave the state, the Department of Environmental Quality authority to participate in the market. So we did that. Our TNC Virginia chapter worked alongside legislators to get that passed. Again, that was kind of a unicorn project where things are a lot more straightforward. It doesn't usually work that way in other places, but that's a lot of times what it takes as well and a lot of countries are actually developing their own climate policies and legislations around carbon markets. probably similar to what's happening in Indonesia as well. And that will also, you know, it's probably meant to make the process a little bit more streamlined, but can also complicate the matter when you have a lot of different users of coastal environments.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Let me start and you finish it off because I'll move into the World Bank approach, right? And then you can do it to make it more clear. In Indonesia, yeah, like, okay, Stephanie set that up very well. Thank you. In Indonesia, the mosaic's clear to us a little bit of forest governance regime and tenure and stuff. That said, we're still investing in it a lot in clarifying tenure and working with a government agency that's doing that. Also an NGO called Landesa. But I'll make it, the clear parts are like, so Indonesia has mangroves in state forests and outside of state forests under district or provincial control called alternate use lands. In alternate use lands, it's a bit straightforward from a governance regime kind of perspective, and you negotiate with the district government or and then the inclusion in the project and eventually benefit sharing. Our process is in a village. Participants of the program are selected in a way where at least 50% of the program participants are women, at least 75% are vulnerable or poorer individuals identified with the village government in partnership with the village government, and using a gendered approach, which we explain and go through then in the work. And those people are engaged directly in some kind of initiative, like restoration and restoration planning or protection of mangroves, or livelihood development, which is a side benefit while all this other stuff takes place. Eventually, benefit sharing has to cover a broader swath of the community. And so that I'll segue in a second to, in the World Bank project, it's a village approach, and then the village is engaged in benefit sharing scheme development, which Hasna, I think, will be able to talk about. There's also voluntary carbon developing in the forestry estate, but currently only in social forest areas, which is a mechanism in Indonesia where communities have co-management rights over their forests, right? And blue carbon is allowed to be developed in those areas with a private sector partner, a government agency, which might be a forest management unit, and then the community, right? And the community in those cases are organized also in formal groups because the government doesn't work with individuals, they work with registered groups. And you have to do a better job there at not just benefiting a group, which is oftentimes maybe the village heads, friends and family, and just trying to spread out the engagement to a broader cross section of the village, and some general village development funds coming later from carbon credit sales and things like that. And always alongside of all that, like I said, investment in sustainable livelihood development that's not carbon related as an incentive as well. I'll segue to you, I think.
Yeah, it's still a very complex question, but very important. I guess in the World Bank, we have the very strong environment and social safeguard framework, which for all the World Bank project, it needs to inline with all the safeguard requirement, which has also include the concern with the project beneficiaries. And in terms of the carbon projects, it's of course in the process of developing the benefit sharing mechanism. So one of the key things I think that is very important and built from the experience in Indonesia is we need to understand the landscape and also the regulatory landscape in the country context, right? As been mentioned, in the case of mangrove, it's divided into the state forest and non-state forest. In the state forest, there's the communities inside it. How do we make sure that the communities is not left behind, right? So they have this incentive of the social forestry, but also to be able to get the access to the social forestry, you need to be registered. But there's also several communities live under the forest that don't have the registry number, but there exists, right? So then the gap will be how the project can actually address the existing regulations that needs to be improved, making sure that everyone can get the benefit, every community can get the benefit, not just one that is acknowledged by the countries. It's the same in the case of non-state land. Some of it is owned by individual, like some of it owns by like very wealthy people, but also there's an abandoned land which communities live underneath it. So is there any regulation? Is there no regulation? So the gap assessment in terms of what the regulations will be needed is very important. Now with the project that Ben and I working is actually we influence the ministry to develop regulations that make sure that on the land that the communities live there, they need to get the guarantee and register that they are legitimate to own and get the benefit of, for example, if there's any carbon project. So this is the whole set complexity. But I guess it's not just like one shoot, but continued process, continued engagement, and making sure that the project captured all the national regulations, but also what is the gap that we can like improve and support developing.
One sentence, one quick gap. There's a decent amount of transmigrant individuals and communities who have converted mangrove lands into other uses, and they're not from those areas, right? And you want to engage them in repairing those areas or restoring or protecting, and they have no stake in the repair because they're not from, they're transmigrants, and that's a big issue that needs to be where it's on our, radar, and we're working on it, but it's really hard to resolve.
Can I add something
Oh,
quickly?
of
Yeah.
course.
So just adding to them, thinking about the carbon value, right, and who actually gets the benefit of that. I mean, maybe there are examples in which that money really is reaching the pockets of communities, but I don't know of any examples of that yet, right? So usually it's through other means and maybe investing in infrastructure, whether that be school, roads, things of this nature. And I recently learned that it's the same thing for payments for ecosystem services type programs administered through the United Nations, in which, the Ministry of Forests or something of a country doesn't actually ever receive the money. It's administered through United Nations programs that then collaborate with the government. So it's really kind of this diffuse distribution of money. So when we think about carbon projects and blue carbon, I think working with the communities first and foremost and understanding how you can support their broader needs, and also recognizing that the carbon value of a project accrues over time, and oftentimes you have to have initial investment to get it up front, and there's a financing period. And so thinking about novel ways in other industries, so the restoration economy, for example, is really interesting to try to build local livelihoods or support for communities. And I've seen this more outside of the blue carbon mangrove space, but people developing nurseries in local areas, because there's a massive shortage of seedlings and genetic stock to kind of restore all of those ecosystems. So I think there is a big potential there. Also thinking, this isn't mangroves, but people planting commercial trees as kind of a shelter wood system to allow shade tolerant native species to recolonize a degraded area. You can harvest those trees after a certain period of time. There's benefits to the community, and then the carbon credits start to generate a little bit later. So thinking about these diverse systems that tap into a lot of the benefits of restoration is super critical, and it has to start with the needs and desires of the community itself.
Great, thank you. We have one last question. I realize we're basically out of time, but maybe we can very quickly kind of respond to this. Question is, I worked in the business sector in Japan before coming to YSE. When we calculated our annual greenhouse gas emissions, it was common to receive validation for our emissions value. global audit firm came to audit our calculation process. And when it was good, we were able to receive a third-party validation for our emissions value. I believe these validation criteria were based on ISO, International Standardization Criteria. So my question is, for the blue carbon credit, is such international validation system being created or going to be created?
Yeah, and I think maybe Stephanie is the right.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I can provide a quick answer. I mean, at least on the voluntary carbon market, each standard has their own process for verifying projects. For instance, on Vera standard, which is one we commonly use, there are independent third parties that are approved validators that validate every project, and they validate the monitoring events, which includes a site visit to the project. So yes, there are standards in place. And I'm assuming that as country programs are developing their own, they're also developing their own protocols as well.
Yeah, and usually the voluntary like validations or verifications is based on the market demands, or was that correct, Stephanie?
So the project developer has to pay for that. That is part of the cost of developing a project, is the project developer must pay for the third-party validator.
Okay.
Mhm.
Nice.
Great. I think we'll call it quits, but I would like to thank our panelists, including Stephanie up here. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And thank you to our online audience. And once again, thank you to Yale Forest Forum and Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture for co-hosting this event. We very much appreciate it. And somebody had asked, we will put the recording, assuming we can get signatures on the legal forms, we will put this video online for others to see as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.